name is Michael Levine, and welcome to another episode of Without Notes, a show that I happen to think is well described by its title. It's a conversation with a fascinating guest without any preconditions or any notes. My partner for the expedition is one of the most acclaimed and esteemed rabbis in the world, Rabbi David Wolpe. He's the author of 8 books, but he is a thought leader, not only in the Jewish community, but in many areas of American intellectual life, and I'm very honored to have him here. Welcome, Rabbi.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So where were you born?
I was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Right.
I lived there till I was 10. My father was a rabbi, and then we moved to Philadelphia, and when people ask me where I grew up, I say Philadelphia. Lived there, went to college there.
Were you a modestly good student?
I was a good student. I have 3 brothers, 2 older, 1 younger. I think we were all reasonably good students.
Right. Now, in the case of your being a good student, is it your memory that you were a good student naturally, or did you have to work at it, or a little of both? Or?
I have very lopsided gifts.
Okay.
I really do, in the sense that math was always a little bit of a struggle for me. Languages, always a little bit of a struggle for me. English, history, philosophy, I did effortlessly and with love both. So I was a voracious reader from the time I was a little kid. And those sorts of things came very easily to me.
All right, so now you go to high school in Philadelphia?
In Philadelphia, to Akiba Hebrew Academy.
Okay. Now, by the way, in high school, by the time you're in high school, you're speaking Hebrew fluently?
Well, languages were one of the areas that I always struggled in. So I spoke Hebrew semi-adequately. Let's put
define
it that way.
Fluently.
Exactly. Semi-adequately.
Okay, great. So you're, and then after high school, what happens to you?
I went to the University of Pennsylvania because I had the great good fortune of my mother having bad teeth. And it was actually a great good fortune.
That's
an original statement.
That's
an
original statement. I have never had a guest say that to me before.
Well, I will tell you why I say that.
All right.
So my oldest brother went to Amherst. And then I'm the third of 4. Then my mother, who, as I say, had bad teeth, went to University of Pennsylvania Dental School to get her teeth fixed for a long time. And one day they said to her, the person who runs the continuing education program just quit. Do you have any interest in doing that? And she, sitting in the dentist chair, said, sure, that sounds interesting. And at that time, being that level of employee, whatever it was, meant that both my second brother and I could, if we got into Penn, we could go for free.
Oh, wow.
So
wow.
My second brother went to Penn, I went to Penn. My older brother left Amherst, got his PhD at Penn. And it was, for us, an unbelievable opportunity. Now, if I owe that to bad teeth.
You do. You really do. Now, had I met you in high school, would you have appeared to me to have come from a middle-class home, a lower middle-class home, or an upper middle-class home? Or
I would have been a middle-class home, slightly heavy, very wisecracky and not always as well behaved as one would expect. And also a pretty avid chess player, which was my principal hobby, and in fact, to this day, remains an interest of mine.
Wow. So when did you begin playing chess?
High school. Because there was a kid in my high school who kept beating me, and it bothered me. And I didn't like it, so I started to study so that I could beat him, and then I became involved in the game in general. Around 14, I started to play, and it became a major interest. To this day, I follow professional chess reasonably closely, which is easy to do with the internet.
Very interesting, yes. Yeah. And of course, many young people today don't take some of the routes that we're discussing, chess in particular, because of the internet.
Right, exactly so.
Or Maybe they play chess on the internet.
They do. I mean, chess on the internet is a huge phenomenon.
Right.
But also there are a lot of other games that are really fascinating and are graphically probably more engaging than chess.
Yeah.
So,
And more addictive.
and more addictive.
Now, so you go to Penn, and what is your major?
So I started off thinking I would major in philosophy, but that required taking German, which I did for a semester and then decided this was a very bad idea.
That was not a crowd pleaser, if I might mention.
It's not that. Yeah, that's actually not why it was a bad. It was a bad idea because, as I said, I'm not great at languages to start with.
Yes.
And
that
and
one
I
in
decided,
particular.
I decided that Mark Twain might be right when he said the German language is just a lousy excuse for spitting at people. But I was not a very successful German student, and then I switched to English literature, which was my great love always, and spent my junior year actually at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland studying English literature, and that's what I graduated with. I graduated with my degree in English and a minor in philosophy.
Okay, so now you're 22, you've graduated college, 22, 23, you've graduated college. What becomes your next step?
I took a year off because I wanted to write, and I wrote some stuff and thought I wanted to be a writer. But at the same time,
And when you took your year off,
Yeah.
Rabbi, did you live at home?
No. I lived in an apartment at Penn, and I made a living by both. I taught Hebrew school, and I also worked at Urban Outfitters in Philadelphia. And there, because I was not good at folding, I ended up selling women's shoes because there were only two departments where you didn't have to fold. One was men's shoes, and they already had someone. So they said, okay, you're in women's shoes. And I sold many espadrilles in my day. And then, but during the summers, I would work at Camp Ramah. And I was out at Camp Ramah in California, here in Ojai, because from Philadelphia it was interesting to go out to camp in California. I just thought it would be for the summer. When a rabbi named Elliot Dorff said to me, what are you doing with your life? And I said, I want to be a writer. And he said, what do you want to write about? And I said, I don't really know anything. I've just always wanted to write. And he said, well, why don't you go to rabbinical school? He said, go for a year. The worst that happens is you learn something, and the best that happens is you find your subject. And I literally wasn't doing anything. And I said, okay. And it was in that instant that I decided I would go to rabbinical school. And I went and loved it. And so I stayed.
And so brought on by a simple twist of fate.
Exactly so. It was honestly, I think if I had not had that conversation, I have no idea what I would have done.
Had you been absent from that meeting that
Exactly,
day?
that's right.
It's just hard to know.
It is hard to know.
Okay, so you go to rabbinic school, and then what becomes of you?
Well, I went to rabbinical school, and the reason I stayed was because, unlike my professors at Penn, the teachers in rabbinical school tried to live what they were teaching. And that seemed to me a much more interesting undertaking than teaching Middlemarch, for example, which is a novel I love, but after you're done teaching it, you don't go out and live Middlemarch.
Right.
And so I finished rabbinical school, and one thing I knew was that I did not want to take a congregation. And we can talk about why that is in a second, but I knew that. So I got a fellowship at I did 2 years in LA, 1 year in Israel, 2 years in New York. And then I got a fellowship back in LA at the university, what was then called the University of Judaism.
And that was what year?
That was 1987.
1987.
So during a 2-year fellowship, I wrote my first book, which was called The Healer of Shattered Hearts, A Jewish View of God. And then I started a career of writing and lecturing. And I taught at the university, and I worked in the library at the university for about 8 years. In that time, I'd gotten married, and
What year did you marry?
1992. And then we moved back east, so I would teach at the seminary and be close to family. But I was still doing a lot of traveling. And when our daughter was about to be born, we decided it would be much better if I was at a congregation, because at least I'd be in the same home every night.
Zip code, yeah.
And at that time, Sinai, the Rabbi of Sinai left, and they called me, and I had already been doing high holiday services here for singles for
Now, this is a
long
big
time.
platform.
It is a big platform.
Big platform. So this,
And so I came back here in '97, and I've been here ever since.
yeah. And you have been a very, very big presence, not only in Jewish life, but in Los Angeles life for a very long time. I can't remember when you weren't a...
So one of the things that is really, that is seemingly, to me it was paradoxical, but it actually is true, is a good friend of mine at the congregation said to me when I was thinking of coming here, he said, you think that you'll have a bigger platform by traveling around and speaking. He said, but actually, as you just said, if you're in the congregation, your platform will be bigger than if you're a sort of independent
Well,
operator.
this particular platform especially.
And it proved to be the case. And I think that that's in part because the Jewish community in the major cities in America has tremendous reach. And if you nudge them a little bit, you can make a genuine difference.
Right. Now, in 1997, Rabbi, the world and people's relationship to their church or synagogue is a different world than the world of today,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
We have seen many studies that indicate that the centrality of religion is significantly diminished, particularly among young people. Is that both true and worrying to your mind, or?
It's true, worrying, and I think a little bit incomplete, only in the sense that the issues that religion addresses, the central issues, are no less important. That is, the search for meaning in life, the desire for connection with other human beings and with something greater than yourself. The comment of William James that the great use of life is to use it on something that will outlast it. People still feel those things. They don't always feel that religion speaks to those concerns with the same cogency that it did to their parents and grandparents.
Yeah.
So
it's out. Many young people feel it's inconvenient and out of date.
Yes, I think that that is true, and so there's a search for both new forms and also more direct experiences. It's one of the reasons why I think psychedelics, meditation, things like that, which actually have a place even in traditional religious structures, although not in the ones we grew up in.
Right.
That's why those things are so powerful.
I was born in New York City. You were in Philadelphia. I don't remember on the Lower East Side psychedelics being a big part of Jewish life.
No,
But what I want to ask you, you didn't mention in talking about religion and Judaism, the capacity for it to instruct the human in areas of wisdom.
Right. Well, one of the things that we've lost to some extent is both the social cohesion that religion offers,
Yep.
and also the moral guidance that religion offers.
Correct.
And that is a huge loss. I don't want to say but, because the but negates what went before it. That is a huge loss, period.
Huge loss,
period.
And by the way, that could be said, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong from your perspective, that could be said by a passionate atheist.
Oh, absolutely. I think so too.
A passionate atheist could say the fact that
Right.
people are disconnected.
Right, absolutely. And I think obviously the pandemic exacerbated that tremendously, but that's a separate question. The thing that I wasn't going to say but I'd say and the modes that religion has to reach out to people in new and different forms, I think, can help with the restoration of some of that, because What unfortunately sometimes tends to happen is as people drift away, religion gets more rigid. Like, you're not doing this, we told you you have to do this, which is an action-reaction movement.
They double down.
Exactly. And therefore, only the people that are already inside the tent stay there, and they just have more and more contempt for the people outside the tent. Whereas I really do believe that that fundamental human need, both for guidance and for rules and boundaries, still exists. We have to find new ways to approach it.
To the people inside the tent,
Yes.
who you know something about, I think they could say with some accuracy, you know, Rabbi, those people outside the tent, they don't look like they're doing too great.
I think that that's true, but then you have to ask yourself, so why do they stay outside the tent? That's the question that I want to know. As a rabbi, my interest in the people outside the tent is not to tell them you're terrible. It's to figure out why.
Well, what about the notion that I mentioned that it's inconvenient? And
okay, so here's a fundamental divide.
Okay.
Sometimes you want to say that someone who doesn't do what I want them to do doesn't do it for bad reasons. I want to know the good reasons they don't do it, because that's what I can change.
Okay.
What I can change is if they say to me, "Look, you don't realize it, but for example, this kind of building doesn't speak to me, even though it spoke to my parents and grandparents. And if you did services outside, I'd be much more interested." Those are the kinds of things I want to know.
Those are tactical.
Right. I'm less interested in saying you're just bad because you don't want to do what I want, because that, from my point of view, that's not productive of getting people to come closer inside the tent by and large.
Or,
yeah,
I guess you choose not to want to say you're just bad because you are more interested in playing on Instagram.
But there again, that's a really, what I want to know is, look, I didn't have Instagram when I was a kid. So I want to know, what is it like to grow up with that? And how can I, as a rabbi, speak to you in a way that, since you grew up with Instagram, will still bring you in? Exactly. We have the same, you and I have the same goals in this conversation.
Yes.
But I don't, my experience is to say to them just, you're not doing it right.
Scolding is probably not an
Generally
doesn't,
right. Most of the time. I mean, there is a place for it. I've scolded my congregation before, and they have scolded me, and we both deserved it sometimes.
Yes.
But as a general practice, I want to know what motivates you, and see, it may be that I can't move the goalposts to include you. It's possible.
So, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, do you think that there's a strong likelihood, maybe not a certainty, but a strong likelihood that people's connectedness to transcendent moral law, religion, will renew in certain ways, or not?
I'm an optimist. Actually,
you are.
I am. I'm by nature. I have a real.
You are an optimist.
I want to say I'm a hopeful person. I really am.
You're an optimist.
Yes.
Everything's going to work out.
It's just I was born with this disposition.
Yes.
It's like, as my daughter sometimes will say to me, she'll go, you know, sometimes the fact that you think everything's going to work out drives me crazy, but I'd much rather you be this way. It's actually ultimately good for me.
Do you know also Thomas Friedman? Great quote.
Yeah.
Thomas Friedman said that pessimists are usually right, optimists are usually wrong, but no great progress has ever been made by a pessimist. I thought that was a great.
I think it's a great quote.
Isn't that great?
I think it's probably true. But also, pessimism saps some of your vitality.
I think that's it.
And I don't feel that. It's like, when you talk about those people outside the tent, as you can see, I want to go get them.
Yeah, the problem with what you're saying is that every pessimist that we know would define themselves as a realist.
Yes, you're exactly right. That is your point well taken. So what I would say is that I think there will be renewals, but I also, I'm an epistemologically humble optimist, by which I mean I don't know what form those renewals will take.
I understand.
And I have to sort of believe that if I put out traditional Jewish wisdom, even though
Which has
it may be
stood
heard
the test of time.
thousands of years,
Yep.
even though it may be heard in different ways, it may be reconfigured in different ways, that it will reach.
This antisocial behavior that we see daily, how much of that is connected in your mind to a society that has drifted away from
Traditional forms of it.
Yes.
The reason I'm smiling is not because those things aren't troubling, but because I want to start with the optimistic read of this.
Okay.
Steven Pinker,
Great.
who says, and he's
Please
right,
please
Steven Pinker, who's
tell.
a professor at Harvard and has written a bunch of books like The Better Angels of Our Nature that gives an optimistic read to human history, says things like, he compares the murder rate in the worst city in the world now. It's still infinitely better than medieval London. He points out that anecdotes have much more currency with us than data. But actually data, in the end, like the fact that we've cut world hunger by over 50% in the past several years. Nobody knows that because it's never a headline, world hunger cut by 50%.
Yes.
So I want to say that in a lot of ways, the world has gotten much, much better without negating what you're saying.
Yes.
Now that I've given my optimistic spin, let me talk about the catastrophes.
I'm asking you, when we see people, young people, walking into retail stores
Yes.
with no shame, brazen, audacious,
So I have two things.
shoplifting, stealing, taking, hitting, pushing, spitting, throwing.
So I have two things to say about that. First of all, the larger breakdown of social trust
Yep.
has a lot to do, I believe, with the algorithms of the internet, with the fact that it encourages performative selves over genuine, authentic selves, that it maximizes for conflict, and that it gives you the sense that society's all out of control. And once you have that sense that society's out of control, then individuals who don't have their own guardrails act however they want, and you get people walking into stores and just taking stuff, and they don't care the cameras are on.
They don't care.
No, it doesn't matter.
But, beautifully said, Rabbi. I see why you're...
I hear the butt coming down the
No,
highway.
no, you're
here.
good at
Okay,
this.
all right.
You speak beautifully
Thank
and
you.
logically. But Rabbi, do you have any doubt that the people that are taking these things, and today now, very kind of interesting, you see young women doing it.
Yes.
It used to be
Used to be young men.
young men,
Exclusively,
right?
yeah.
Exclusively young men.
Yeah.
Today, 30-40% of the people can be young women. Do you have any doubt, Rabbi, that the people doing this likely didn't go to Sunday school the week before, or didn't get raised in a home in which the Ten Commandments were posted, or a school in which the Ten Commandments were posted? Is that confusing at all to you?
No, not at all. I mean, there's no question that there is a social capital that religion creates.
Yep.
That Will Herberg, who was a Jewish philosopher, used to say that religion gives losing religion in a society gives you what he called cut flower ethics.
Yes.
Flowers will stay in bloom if they're in the soil.
Yes.
At least in theory, or plants will.
Watered and sun.
Watered and sun. If you cut them, they will stay in bloom for a little while, but eventually they'll wither and wilt and die.
So that is an example if you give somebody roses or something.
Exactly. Give them roses, they'll last for
Week.
a couple. Yeah.
And you are making the point, cut flower ethics
Right.
is a conversation or analogy about how if you cut people from the transcendent laws, don't be surprised that in some quick amount of time.
Especially
They will.
especially when there are other social pressures that are pushing people to do bad things.
Like what? Like the internet?
Like the internet, and also like the fact that breakdown is contagious. So,
Breakdown
in
is
other words, if you,
contagious.
to introduce another analogy, James Q. Wilson had this broken windows theory, which
I'm
is
somewhat familiar with it.
which is if you go through a neighborhood and you see a couple broken windows, you think nobody's tending this place, and
The
you
bad
yourself,
guys are in charge.
You yourself are more likely to act lawlessly because you figure place is what we'd call in Jewish talk hefker. It's like nobody cares, nobody's paying attention.
Right.
So he said when a window is broken, you should fix it immediately because it sends that signal. And in a place like some of our major cities, there are a lot of broken windows, either literally or metaphorically. And so that bad behavior even starts to encourage people who in other conditions might not.
That's what.
And I worry about
Will
that
stated.
too. So some people would say, yes, I'm shoplifting. I know it's objectively wrong. I know I'm acting as a criminal. I'm doing something that's wrong.
Yeah.
And then there are people who are sociologically revolutionaries. They're saying, it's not wrong for me to do this. I don't acknowledge the validity of the law. If you don't believe in some kind of law, whether social or transcendent, then yes, everything is a matter of personal opinion.
Do you believe that many of the people shoplifting or doing even worse, many worse things, would justify their behavior and saying it's not wrong because Walmart's been ripping off
No question. That's exactly what they would say.
Yeah, they would justify, I'm not shoplifting. I'm
taking back what
belongs to me.
Yes.
And
because nobody likes to think of themselves as bad. And that's how social institutions get broken down, and eventually societies do.
do you think that the leadership of this nation that you witnessed today in 2023, both parties,
Now you're hitting something
are
where
up
it's hard for me to be optimistic. No, I do not see the quality and depth and integrity of leadership that is required by the severity of our problems right now. I don't. I wish I did.
I agree with
And
you.
maybe tomorrow someone will come along that you and I don't, we know the name now, but we don't know the person, maybe, but I don't see it so far.
It seems so much of the leadership of both parties is engaged in something, I guess, that could be referred to as pandering.
Yeah, and people
Just telling
argue,
people what they want to hear so they'll vote for them.
Emerson once said to Thoreau, do we always have to talk for victory instead of truth? And I feel like that's what the two parties are doing. We need to win. You could do the best thing in the world.
Correct.
You could, like tomorrow, invent a cure for cancer. And if I'm on the opposite party, I would say, look at that, all those poor patients who were doing fine, and you just invented this terrible thing.
Rabbi, talk for a minute about your book that did the best of the 8 books you've written. You had one that was particularly commercially successful. Talk about that and its principal and its central lesson.
So it was called Making Loss Matter, Creating Meaning in Difficult Times. And it was actually based on a sermon that my father gave once, where he talked about how there is a yizkor, which is a memorial service for people who died.
Yep.
But there isn't a service for things that die while we're still alive. And I thought that was a brilliant idea.
Yeah.
Like dreams that die. Or people who are immigrants who've lost their home country and their home language. We have so many losses in our lives.
Yeah.
And the central lesson of the book is that a lot of times people will search for the reason why something happened when they would be much better off making the loss meaningful in their lives, because you can't change the fact that you lost except in as much as you can make it meaningful. So people who start charities for diseases when they lost somebody that they loved for the disease, they don't know why it happened to that person, but they know they can do something with it that will make other lives better. And here, I want to tell you a very brief and beautiful story that I love to tell, that a Rabbi Hugo Grin, who grew up in Auschwitz, used to tell all the time about when he was a little kid in Auschwitz with his father. And it was Hanukkah, the time of lighting the candles at the winter festival. And his father took the margarine ration that they had for food, and he used it as oil to light the Chanukiah, the menorah for Hanukkah. And Grin said, as a child, he said to his father, "How can you do this? This is our food. We're practically starving here." And his father said to him, "My child, we have learned that you can go for 3 weeks without food. You can go for 3 days without water, but you can't go for 3 minutes without hope." And that, I think, is what religion at its deepest core does for human beings, is it gives them hope that this isn't meaningless, it isn't empty, what you do matters.
That was wonderful.
And that it'll make a difference.
Rabbi, we're going to close by inviting you to try to tell, you're still a young man. What does the future hold for you? Although we don't know what the future holds, but what is your intention for the next 10 years? What's left to accomplish? Where have you...
So I've seen a lot. I mean, I had a brain tumor. I've had 2 neurosurgeries. I had lymphoma. I feel like every day that I'm still alive is actually a tremendous gift. I feel like I'm living on borrowed time. We all are. I used to say to my congregation,
by a man with a brain tumor who's an optimist. Now, that is...
I used to say to my congregation, we all have had a terminal diagnosis. It's just that I know it. So what I would like to be able to do in the next 10 years, if given the chance, and I hope starting next year, is to take the same sorts of messages that I gave to the congregation, to give them to the Jewish world and to beyond the Jewish world, because I think
in what forum?
In writing, in speaking, in whatever way I can, whatever
so you are
venue
leaving,
I find. I'm leaving here next year. I'll be at Harvard Divinity School as a visiting scholar for a year, and then after that, I'm working with a couple different organizations, and I'll be emeritus rabbi here.
If you're trying to convert me to optimism, maybe the fact that Harvard still has a divinity school could be a good... That could be...
I don't know. I mean, I think that it's going to be a very interesting... my culture is not exactly the same as the one that I understand prevails there.
Perhaps.
It's going to be very interesting to see what that's going to be like.
Perhaps.
But yeah, so here's my greatest hope is that I will be able to move through the world, and again, to go back to Emerson, whom I love, he said that the trick is to be the same in the marketplace as you are in your study. Everybody in their study has integrity because they're alone. So in the congregation, I've been able to be more or less a consistent person. I want to be able to carry that beyond the congregation into the world.
You're going to be leaving here, you're going to Harvard
just
for a year.
Yeah.
And then writing, and then book, and then other formats. Could be the internet, could be...
Yes, we'll see.
It'll be interesting. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
You were an outstanding guest, and your authenticity, your transparency, your vulnerability was exceptional. So I feel like...
Thank you.